Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Refining Exegetics and to tonight's live stream. Sort of a little impromptu. Wasn't given much uh, uh, forward notice in regards to this, but I wanted to take the opportunity to give a presentation to any who would be joining and to open up discussion later on. But tonight's live stream, the focus that the topic that I'll be talking about is what the Bible refers to as, what the apostles referred to as sound doctrine. And to contrast what the Bible refers to as sound doctrine with what's often put forward within a lot of Christian traditions as doctrine or biblical doctrine. And so I want to sort of disambiguate that and really get clear on what is going on with doctrine in the Bible. Uh, so uh, with that introduction, gonna take a moment to get some links going so that people can have a link to the live stream on various platforms. So give me a moment to do that. I'm just adjusting a couple things here. We'll get going here shortly, folks. Bear with me. All right, I'm just maneuvering windows around and getting things so that while I'm presenting, I can still see the live chat and engage with you all there. So almost ready here. I'll get this streamlined at some point. I see you at the theology experience. Trey, good evening to you, and Flatlass. Thank you for tuning in. Yeah, Flatlass. I know it's late, uh, and no worries about falling asleep. I have, frankly, I have one of those uh gentle tones to my voice that tends to put people to sleep if I'm not careful. We'll see how it goes. All right. So just as again introduction, the title of this live stream is Dogma Sin and the Sin of Dogma. And the question that we're going to be exploring tonight is, what is sound doctrine according to the Bible? And so there's a little bit of play on words between the Greek and the English here. Dogma sin is a Greek word that appears a number of times, in particularly in Paul's writings, and it's where we get the English word dogma from. It's sort of the same root, and well, it's sort of the plural of dogma, dogma sin, and it's interesting that well, the theme that I'm going to be exploring and that I'm going to be sort of drawing out as we go through some texts uh, is that Paul presents dogma sin as something that stands in contradistinction and in contrast and in sort of opposition to the commandments of God, stands in opposition to uh, righteousness. And what we're going to find is, I think, is that dogmatism is something that enslaves people that we need to be freed from, and that the righteousness that comes through Yeshua is what delivers us from that dogma sin. And it's interesting that the the suffix at the end of dogma is sin, and what we're going to be talking about is the sin of dogma. Uh, and how this contrasts with what Paul presents as sound doctrine. And and what I hope to the goal of this let's see. Let me stop sharing my screen for a second. Um so it would be to argue um that sound doctrine is the teachings of the law and the prophets, continued by Jesus and his apostles, which instruct in godly living, holiness, godliness, and obedience. Um, in contrast to sound doctrine, what I'm going to be presenting is that sound doctrine stands obviously in opposition to false doctrine, bad teaching, uh, and the number of times that the phrase sound doctrine comes up in Paul's writings, particularly in his pastoral epistles, is that uh, well the the context makes it clear that sound doctrine is something that leads people away from licentiousness and lawlessness, and that sound doctrine is what leads to godliness. So fundamentally, sound doctrine comes up within the context of character, of ethics, of uh, godly living. And so when Paul talks about teaching, um, and we'll get into this in both Titus and in First Timothy, the exhortation is that these overseers would continue in sound teaching. The Greek term underlying that is didaskalia. Um, and this is the term that gets mainly rendered with the English teaching or doctrine. And um, well, the encouragement is that there are those who are teaching other things that aren't sound teaching, and it's leading people into divisions, into contentions, and ungodliness. And so we'll see that as a recurring theme as we go through this. Flatlass says, Jared, you would make a great audiobook narrator. Maybe one day I'll do that. I'm not sure. Avery, what's up? What up? Good to see you. Let's see. Trey says, sound doctrine leads you away from lawlessness and toward godliness. Yep. True, true. All right. So, by way of introduction, I'm going to bring up Titus chapter 2. Let me see if I can. Why aren't you? Maybe I can do it this way. Ah, that's why it's not working. There we go. All right. So, reading from the English Standard Version. But as for you, teach what accords with sound doctrine. Now, when we go to the Greek, what we have is sound or healthy, hygienos didaskalia, and that roughly translates to sound or healthy doctrine. Then goes right into older men are to be sober-minded, dignified, self-controlled, sound in faith, in love, and in steadfastness. Uh, Older women likewise are to be reverent in behavior, not slanderers or slaves to much wine. They are to teach what is good, and so train young women to love their husbands and children, and so forth. You sort of get the idea that right in the context of Paul talking about teaching sound doctrine are things related to ethics, are things related to character, being self-controlled, uh, faith, working through love, that sort of thing. Um, and and so that's he goes on in verse 11. This is the kind of the crux of the matter. For the grace of God has appeared, bringing salvation for all people, training us to renounce ungodliness and worldly passions and to live self-controlled, upright, and godly lives in the present age. Yeah. Who gave himself for us to redeem us from all lawlessness and to purify for himself a people for his own possession who are zealous for good works. So sound teaching leads to this training and to renounce ungodliness. And I'm going to continue to bring out this contrast between what we just read and what it seems to be that sound doctrine, sound teaching is related to, between that and in Christianity, what we're so used to is you'll hear pastors and apologists and theologians all the time. They'll say things like, tonight we're going to talk about the doctrine of dot 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 dot, and usually what follows after the doctrine of is propositional statements, formulations like penal substitutionary atonement, or the doctrine of sola fide, or the doctrine of justification by faith alone, or the doctrine of the eternal decree of God. Uh, the, Notice that these are conceptual propositional statements, and the idea is that these are the doctrines that the apostles supposedly handed us, and we're to affirm these statements and all of the theological ideas that they entail. But notice that the stark difference between what that's talking about and what Paul is talking about here in Titus 2. Sound doctrine is related to right living, whereas whenever theologians, pastors, and lay people alike say the doctrine of dot dot dot, they're talking about propositional statements, theological, sometimes even metaphysical statements that aren't related at all to the way you live. They're just propositional statements that we're supposedly supposed to affirm in order to be considered orthodox, or in order to be considered in the faith, um, in order to be considered true believers. And in that latter mindset, doctrine is something that you hold to and that you're to affirm, regardless of whether you're living rightly or not. So that becomes hugely important as we move through this. Oh, yes. Flatlass says, or the ever popular doctrines of grace. Yep. Yeah, uh there is no doctrines of grace in the Bible. Um again, this is almost without fail. I struggle to find, and maybe uh help me in the chat if you're able to think of one instance where you hear somebody say the doctrine of, and then whatever follows that is something that the Bible explicitly says, like an actual phrase or teaching in the Bible. I struggle to find even one instance. And let me know in the chat if you can think of one instance of one doctrine of insert, um, where it's actually something that the Bible actually says. Um, what we'll find is that um, these these doctrines of dot 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 are simply stand-ins for um things that the Bible actually doesn't say, but we're going to piece things together systematically from a little here, a little there, a precept here, a line here, and a line there, and sort of build it all together, piece together, and build a doctrine out of it. Um, yeah, Trey says the doctrine of self-control, the doctrine of husbands love their wives like Christ loved the church. Yeah, that would be doctrines, and there are um where we actually have examples or teachings related to those things. Um, uh, we um, and we might, and not would even hesitate to even put titles like that onto them, uh, like that. Uh, what we should really say in a general sense is that doctrine is what leads to those things in your life. Sound doctrine inculcates within you the type of heart and the type of posture, orientation towards God that uh, that compels you and uh, energizes you, if we're to use sort of a spiritual look, a sort of spiritual dynamic where you're energized to then walk according to those things and manifest those fruits of the spirit in your life. So that's kind of the way that I would put it. So let's jump to another text. We got First Timothy 1. Again, Paul is urging now Timothy, as I urged you when I was going to Macedonia, this is in verse 3, remain at Ephesus so that you may charge certain persons not to teach any different doctrine. Again, this is teaching, didaskalia, nor to devote themselves to myths and endless genealogies which promote speculations rather than the stewardship from God that is by faith. And now here's the crux. The aim of our charge or our teaching is love that issues from a pure heart and a good conscience and a sincere faith. So what you have is this contrast between those who are presenting a different doctrine that leads to speculations, that leads to a fixation on myths, on little minutia things. He later goes on to say that these are people who desire to be nomo didaskalia, teachers of law. And so that's in verse 6. Certain persons, by swerving from these, again, these would be love that issues from a pure heart and good conscience and sincere faith, have wandered away into vain discussion. Kind of sounds like the propositional statements that we were talking about earlier. Desiring to be teachers of law without understanding either what they are saying or the things about which they make confident assertions. So what we have in that sort of pericope is, let's see if I can find my notes here. So we have our teachers who are bringing a different doctrine, and it's leading to things like myths and speculations, whereas we have statements like from Jesus, from Yeshua, who said, if you want to enter life, keep the commandments. That's Matthew 19:17. And Paul, who said, it's the doers of the law who will be declared righteous, Romans 2:13. In Matthew 5:18-20, Yeshua says, except that our righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, we shall not enter the kingdom of heaven. And that this involves both doing and teaching the least of the commandments. The subsequent teaching in Matthew 5 that I'm just talking about now is typical rabbinic discourse, interpretation of the law meant to instruct God's people on how to walk out and obey the commandments. And furthermore, Paul teaches that the law is spiritual and that it's through the Spirit that we fulfill the righteous requirements of the law and submit to God's law. This is Romans 7 and Romans 8. if our righteousness and being declared righteous are directly linked to keeping the commandments, and then keeping the commandments is linked to walking by the Spirit, then our conclusion must be that the that sound doctrine is oriented to not only understanding and interpreting, but keeping the commandments of God. Um, so what Paul is doing in this section of First Timothy, chapter 1, is he's drawing attention to this other teaching and these people who are sort of propping themselves up in order to be uh, teachers and bringing this different doctrine. Uh, Paul is subverting their influence through connecting their misguided motives with useless myths and empty discussions. Uh, that these terms are squarely in continuity with Second Temple period polemics against invalid teaching and interpretations. So fundamentally what Paul is describing here is a clash of interpretations and teachings in regard to either the law of Moses or, in a broader sense, Jewish regulations or Jewish law. Philo criticizes those who, quote, pursue subtle inquiries but neglect the improvement of character. Does that kind of sound familiar? So it's this fixation on subtle inquiries, but while neglecting the improvement of yourself, living in godliness. That comes from On the Migration of Abraham, 89 through 93. Likewise, Josephus in his Against Apion, uh, one uh, one point 17 through 18, contrasts speculative mythologies which lack moral force with the practice of the law. And let me check back on the chat here. All right. Doctrine of a legit Hebrew beard. I'm not sure exactly what that's in reference to. Um, but anyways, okay. So moving on to my notes here. Uh, so Paul goes on to describe the fruit of these same teachers later on in First Timothy in chapter 4, verse 1. He describes some as devoting themselves to deceitful spirits and teachings of demons, resulting in harsh regulations of abstinence. He goes on in verse 7 to speak of irreverent and silly myths. In First Timothy 6:9, Paul describes these teachings as causing them to fall into the temptations of many senseless and harmful desires through the irreverent babble and contradictions of what is falsely called knowledge. That's a key point here. So Paul may be addressing a specific type or specific group of people who are conducting themselves in a very specific way, and there's a sort of asceticism and harsh abstinence and harsh treatment of the body, which is somewhat similar to what he talks about in Colossians chapter 2, in regards to the traditions of men and man-made regulations. But what he what he says there at the end of Colossians 2 is that these regulations, though having an air of wisdom, this is you get a sense that he's sort of talking about the same thing when he talks about knowledge here in 1 Timothy 6:9. Or no, I'm sorry, that's verse 20 in chapter 6. That he goes on to say that yet these have no power in order to restrain the flesh. So these are people who are teaching this, this high wisdom and this esoteric knowledge, and yet they're living licentiously. So it's an interesting dynamic there. Again, we're talking about how dogma and man-made regulations lead to sin because the focus is taken away from God's commandments and put instead upon the seeking of either esoteric knowledge or a focus or an obsession with minutia, and I would say that there's a connection. There's a very clear connection between that and what we find in just run-of-the-mill common Christianity today. Is a fixation on getting these doctrinal propositional statements correct, and focusing so much on those that as long as you get those correct, it doesn't really matter how you're living. You can just believe in the doctrines of grace, or you can just believe in the eternal decree of God, and you can argue about it with others and be an armchair theologian or a keyboard warrior, defending these doctrines of dot dot dot, and dying on that hill, all the while you're slandering people that you're talking to. You're being a jerk with your rhetoric. And so that's because the reason for that is you're no longer talking about biblical teaching and embodying the fruits of the Spirit. You're simply defending tooth and nail these propositional statements and these formulas and these systematic theologies that uh, take the place, or that it becomes part of your core identity. It defines you as a Christian. It's sort of what defines me as a Christian is I believe in sola fide. I believe in the doctrines of grace. That's why I'm a Christian. That's what makes me a Christian. It's like, no, um, the religion that God accepts and that is pleasing to him is to look after orphans and widows in their distress and to keep oneself from being polluted uh, by the world. That's our brother. That's our brother James. uh, so, and this isn't anything new. Let's go back to um, the Hebrew scriptures, the Older Testament, and we go to a place like Proverbs 4. Hear, my children, the instruction of a father, and give attention to know understanding, for I give you good doctrine. This is Proverbs 4, verse 2. Do not forsake my law. So here we have um, a clear cut connection between uh, good doctrine and obedience to commandments, to the instructions of God. Trey says, I'll say it. Most systematic theology is exactly what Paul was talking about. Yeah, that it's true. Uh, Systematic theology often inculcates an unhealthy obsession with the minutia of language, with getting propositional statements correct and making it as complex as possible, uh, all the while neglecting the weightier matters of obedience, of um, walking in the Spirit, um, living godly lives. Um, Truth be told, I uh, around I want to say around the early so yeah the early 2000s, the first decade of the 2000s. There was a some of you know, I'm 44, just turned 44 today, and some of you who are around, if you're listening, if you're around that age, you'll remember a movement within evangelical Christianity towards a sort of what would be called or there are different words for the movement or different names for it, but it's sort of organic Christianity or the emergent church movement. There were books like Donald Miller's Blue Like Jazz. There was a whole kind of a generation of young Christians in their 20s who were fed up with dogmatism and wanted to be more, authentic, and um, they're reading books like Blue Like Jazz, sort of a non-religious uh, commentary on spirituality, and it was this uh, wanting to be authentic, but wanting to live out the the gospel in a real way, loving um others, and so there is um some of that may be wishy-washy, and when I say things like that, you're what comes to mind, you're probably thinking like progressive Christianity, and th there there's a lot of validity to that critique, because it sort of goes swinging headlong into the other side of the pendulum. Uh, but what was at the core of that was really a desire to live out biblical teaching and doctrine, um, as opposed to a fixation on dogmatism. And but what needs to happen is that impulse to get away from dogmatism needs to be directed. It needs to be hitched to the yoke of the commandments of God, uh, so um, that direction, or that impulse can be directed towards godliness, and not to just sort of a humanistic and and irreligious uh, expression, if that makes sense. Let me know if any of you are familiar with that book that I mentioned, Blue Like Jazz. Let me know in the comments if you read that. I think I still have it somewhere in a box. Let's see. Flatlass says, I've been reading Dr. Dustin Smith's new systematic theology of the early church book, and it's been pretty good so far. Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm gonna find myself digging into that or not. I mean, certainly if there was a systematic theology work that I was going to read, that I would read, it would be that one. Because I deeply respect the work of Dr. Dustin Smith. Um, love his presentations, love his podcast, the Biblical Unitarian podcast. Very well put together. Yeah, I agree. Kingdom Seekers. The Sabbath is a blessing. All right. So, let's go to continuing on in a few other passages or a couple other passages. Let me pull this up. This is Galatians 5. And let's see, when just want to make sure oh yeah. So Paul makes a number of statements in 5 and 6 that sort of uh, drive the point that I want to make home. For in verse 6, for in Christ Jesus, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision has any value. What matters is faith expressing itself through love. Um, and the uh, what's going on here in Galatians 5 is that there's a doctrine that's being put forth by which new Gentile converts are being compelled to be circumcised in order to become Jews. And this is a law that's being foisted upon them, or that they're being compelled to obligate themselves to. Um, and the people who are teaching this, or who want to be, who would seek to be justified through this circumcision process, uh, they are, Paul says that they're being severed from Christ. And uh, he goes on to describe why that is. Well, um, for a Gentile convert who's seeking the circumcision process, Paul says that neither circumcision or uncircumcision, if you're uncircumcised or circumcised, it doesn't have any value next to the importance of faith expressing itself through love. And the reason being is because, well, the second greatest commandment is to love your neighbor as yourself. Hence why he says, but do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh. Rather, serve one another in love. The entire law, all the law, is fulfilled in a single decree: love your neighbor as yourself. But if you keep on biting and devouring one another, watch out, or you will be consumed by one another. Right there. So why would Paul mention that if it if not for the fact that the community that he's writing to, uh that this sort of behavior is going on, this boasting or relying upon circumcision and being compelled to do that is giving an opportunity for the flesh, for people to boast in their flesh. And whenever you have that, it just inevitably results in uh, dissensions, strife. Uh, but apparently, it's leading to people biting and devouring one another, and that, of course, is against the commandments of God to love your neighbor as yourself. So this is a um, just a practical, a pragmatic uh, situation where you have a dogma that's being presented, and the very dogma itself, the fruit of that is leading people, excuse me, away from the commandments. Uh, and they're doing things actually in violation of the commandments and therefore walking in sin. Hence why it says you need to walk by the Spirit and not gratify the desires of the flesh. So let's go to our master himself, Yeshua. Let's go to a passage like Mark 7. So in this situation, many of you would well know this one, is that some Pharisees came and saw that Yeshua's disciples were not eating with washed hands. They were eating with unwashed hands. In the verse 3, for the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands properly, holding to the tradition of the elders. This is what Paul would later call dogmasin. This is dogmasin, tradition of the elders. Now, this isn't to say that all tradition is bad, but in this very instance, as we'll see, this is a tradition that itself led the Pharisees and certain leaders to misjudge, to and to be to and focus on outward ritual to the neglect of actually doing the commandments. And so this is why the rebuke that Yeshua gives is, well, did Isaiah prophesy of you hypocrites, as it is written, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrine the commandments of men. Now, this is important. I want to draw this out in the Greek here. Teaching. This is the verb form of didaskalia, didaskantes. So it's the verb and then the noun right after it. The didaskantes, didaskalias. Teaching as doctrine. So the precepts in Tamata, this word, so it's like a precept. So we have a distinction between what men come up with as these precepts or these regulations, and these are specifically referred to as uh, belonging to men. So these are regulations or precepts of men. And these people are teaching these precepts as if they are doctrines. This is a clear, I mean, this is a critical point that I want to make throughout this entire presentation, that I want to drive home, is that in Christianity, what people call the doctrines of are really just precepts of men that are being taught as if they are doctrines, as if they are commandments and things that we are to hold to and believe. And you go to the law of Moses, you will not you will not see a single commandment in there in a single instance of saying you need to wash your hands before you eat your food. This is a regulation of man, and certain Pharisees and leaders are presenting it as if it's a commandment from God. That is the rebuke. That's what leads to their condemnation. He goes on. Yeshua says, you leave the commandment of God and hold to the tradition of men. And again, we can go to a passage like Colossians 2. So see to it that no one takes you captive by philosophy and empty deceit, according to human tradition, according to the elemental spirits of the world, and not according to Christ. So keep that in mind. We're talking about human tradition. By canceling the, this is a bad, just a bad rendering of the Greek. The Greek is, um, we can pull that up here. Oops, next verse. There we go. Choreographon tois dogmasin. So here's that word, dogmasin. That there's no record of debt here in the Greek. This is talking about um, decrees and ordinances. But again, in the context, we're talking about of men. These are traditions of men. Come on now. Okay, back to here. So, therefore, let no one disqualify you from keeping the commandments of God, including the Sabbaths and the feasts, the new moons, uh, insisting on asceticism and worship of angels, going on in detail about visions puffed up without reason by his sensuous mind. Sounds very familiar to what Paul's talking about in First Timothy. And not holding fast to the head, from whom the whole body, nourished and knit together through its joints and ligaments, grows with a growth that is from God. If with Christ you died to the elemental spirits of the world, who are these are the forces and powers and spirits that are behind the traditions of men that Paul is talking about here. Why, as if you were still alive in the world, do you submit to regulations like do not handle, do not taste, do not touch, according to human precepts and teachings? Again, sound familiar to what Yeshua was? So Paul is thoroughly immersed in the same sort of uh, battle that Yeshua himself was um, engaged in. These have indeed an appearance of wisdom in promoting self-made religion and asceticism and severity to the body, but they are of no value in stopping the indulgence of the flesh. So again, we have these fixation on these ultra um, uh, these traditions and regulations, and we're not talking about the law of Moses here. Excuse me. We're not talking about the commandments of God here. We're talking about man-made regulations. And it's in pursuit of these that it actually leads to further and further um, sin. And that's what dogma sin does. It leads to sin. It um it so just on an inner spiritual and heart level, the dynamics in the heart, when you fixate on this type of religious knowledge, you start to feel okay with the idea that you have this knowledge, despite the fact that inwardly in your heart and outwardly, you aren't growing in holiness one bit. Sometimes you're even going back, and yet you're okay. You feel okay because you have this knowledge, you have this knowing. Um, and that is the snare of dogmasin. And there are many there's parallel passages in Matthew um and other parts of the gospels where Yeshua is um calling out the traditions of men, that and the traditions of the elders and things that lead away that it's a teaching that leads people away from actually the weighty matters of the law, like love, justice, mercy, um, and it's an unhealthy obsession uh, with types of knowledge. All right, let's see what's going on in the chat here. Mhm. Okay. Let me check my notes here. Oh, so I wanted to keep reading. So with Mark chapter 7, um I really want to finish, or really want to read the rest of the account here because it really draws it all together. In Mark 7:9, and Yeshua, said to them, "You have a fine way of rejecting the commandment of God in order to establish your tradition. For Moses said, 'Honor your father and your mother, and whoever reviles father or mother must surely die.' But you say, if a man tells his father or his mother, 'Whatever you would have gained from me is korban,' or a gift that is given to God, then you no longer permit him to do anything for his father or mother, thus making void the word of God by your tradition that you have handed down, and many such things you do." So right off the bat, we have an instance where their tradition leads them to set aside a weightier matter of the law in order to fixate on this minutia of the situation where it's sort of a loophole to get out of actually doing the commandment, um, and to fixate on this legality. Um, this is what legalism is. This is what I like to define as legalism. Legalism is setting aside the commandment of God, which is freedom, in order to practice something that's more of a legality. That's this it's sort of a loophole. And the practical effect of that is you look more holy outwardly because look, I'm presenting this thing. I'm going above and beyond to present this as a gift to God. Meanwhile, you're dishonoring your father and mother. That's a more weightier matter of the law than this gift outwardly that you're doing, that you're trying to give to God. And so it's a fundamentally wrong orientation toward the commandments. He goes on, "Hear me, all of you, and understand. There is nothing outside a person that by going into him can defile him, but the things that come out of a person are what defile him." And when he had entered the house and left the people, his disciples asked him about the parable. And he said to them, "Then are you also without understanding? Do you not see that whatever goes into a person from outside cannot defile him, since it enters not his heart, but his stomach, and is expelled?" And he said, "What comes out of a person is what defiles him. For from within, out of the heart of man, come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, coveting, wickedness, deceit, sensuality, evil slander, pride, foolishness. All these evil things come from within, and they defile a person." So, uh, following the commandments of God lead to inward purity that reflects an outward manifestations of righteousness, of doing good works. Whereas a fixation on man-made tradition sort of like, again, makes you feel good about yourself while inwardly you're full of these things, and these things are practical, ethical, moral matters. Let's see. Just looking over my notes, see if I've got anything else. So, this leads into the final part of what I want to say is that uh, just as there's sound doctrine that leads to godliness, uh, as opposed to false doctrine, which are human regulations and traditions that lead away from godliness and actually into uh, they have the propensity to lead people into a fixation on certain things that distract from actually walking in the fruits of the spirit, and thus leading into some type of sin or transgression. Just as you have that sort of contrast, uh, the the sound doctrine that leads to godliness compelled the apostles to pronounce anathema or cursing on um, things that are false doctrine because they lead away from godliness. And so there's a contrast between what the apostles, when we're reading the scriptures, when they use the word anathema, uh, Paul says things like, if anyone does not love the Lord, let him be anathema. Well, we understand scripturally, biblically, what loving the Lord looks like. It looks like following the commandments. If you love me, you'll keep my commandments. Over and over and over again, the constant refrain the from the Hebrew scriptures all the way to Revelation. The intent is for God's people under the 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 direction and guidance and instruction from the Spirit is to walk in obedience to the commandments and therefore live. In contrast to that, uh, what do we find anathema being used in later church uh, councils? Well, they're pronouncing anathemas on you're not getting the language of the proposition correct. Um, that's sort of what um, that's sort of what happens here. Let me see. So, I mean, in the scriptures, anathema, again, this is, when somebody says, let him be accursed, the anathemas in the apostolic writings, they target acts, allegiances, and practices that rupture relationship with God. Um, it's it's a covenantal thing, it's a relational thing. But when we get to the later ecumenical councils, something changes. Now the anathema is attached almost entirely to propositional statements. Uh, Sort of like, if you say Christ has one will, anathema. If you divide natures incorrectly, anathema. If your ontology misses the mark, anathema. So the curse formula shifts from this destroys covenant loyalty to now this formulation threatens doctrinal coherence. So cursing gets attached to anything that starts to mess with the coherence of the whole theological propositional system. Um, it's sort of like you never find the apostles anathematizing people for getting their Christology or for being imprecise with Christology. Um, yeah, John says things like, uh, you can you can tell when somebody is born of the Spirit, is born of God, if they confess that Jesus was flesh. Well, because there were those who were going around saying that actually Jesus didn't have flesh, actually. He's this emanation of God and therefore can't be flesh because they had this duality and this dualism between the material and the spiritual. And the material is inherently corrupt and evil, and therefore this pure emanation from God, this Jesus can't be an actual man, and therefore couldn't have actually been flesh. He only appeared to have flesh. Well, it's these very people who are going around who have no concern for their own flesh, and so they're seeking high conceptual esoteric knowledge, all the while they're corrupting their own flesh because the flesh doesn't matter. That's the dogma. All right, so that's where I'm going to sort of land it. There is you have not only distinction between sound doctrine and dogma sin, but you have a contrast between what the apostles uh, anathematized people for, which was disobedience, licentiousness, departing from faithfulness into either weird theologies, speculative uh, myths, or just straight working evil. In the same way, you have a contrast between what the apostles anathematized and what later councils would pronounce anathemas on. And you just have a clear departure from apostolic tradition when you start getting into the councils, the later councils like the Nicene councils and the Cappadocians. These anathemas that they pronounced were on you're not you don't have the right propositional statement or the right metaphysical language. Um, that has nothing to do with actually walking in godliness. So um, that's so to sum up and to wrap that all up, uh, sound doctrine is the teaching and the interpretation and the application of God's commandments through the Spirit that leads you to walk in godliness, self-control, all the fruits of the Spirit, and all that stuff to grow in godliness and attain to the fullness of God. That's what sound teaching is. That's what doctrine is in the Bible. Um, and ergo, false doctrine are things that depart from that and lead people into disobedience. Let's see. wonder why I'm not able to scroll down. Okay. So with that, I will pin the link to the to join and discuss if you're so inclined. I'll I'll pin that link to the top of the chat. All right, so yep, the link to join is there in the chat. Yeah, yeah, I did no I did have some observations and thoughts on James 2 on your article that you wrote on that tray. Um, and that to me, so James 2, let me go to this really quick. Oh, so James opens up chapter 2 with verse 1. Oh, the key point is verse 10, that the oft quoted, for whoever keeps the whole law but fails in one point has become guilty of all of it. We have to we have to contextualize this. We have to realize that the critical issue that James is addressing here in the community is that certain people are showing partiality against poor, the less high status individuals, and showing preference and partiality towards higher status people. Uh, and James says, my brothers, show no partiality as you hold the faith in our Lord Jesus Christ, the Lord of glory. For if a man wearing a gold ring and fine clothing comes into your assembly, and a poor man in shabby clothing also comes in, and if you pay attention to the one who wears the fine clothing and say, you sit here in a good place, while you say to the poor man, you stand over there or sit down at my feet, have you not then made distinctions among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? This is a critical point. Uh, these people are making judgments, and their judgments are based on evil thoughts, um, on showing partiality. So they are conducting themselves in a way that leads them to show partiality, which is a fundamental prohibition in the law. Uh, we are not to be ones who show partiality, because God does not show partiality. So we're to imitate God. in that way. Listen, my brothers, has not God chosen those who are poor in the world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom, which he has promised to those who love him? But you have dishonored the poor man. Are not the rich the ones who oppress you and the ones who drag you into court? Are they not the ones who blaspheme the honorable name by which you were called? If you really fulfill the royal law according to the scripture, Leviticus 18:5, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, you are doing well. But if you show partiality, you are committing sin and are convicted by the law as transgressors. Um, my viewpoint here is that you can't proclaim to be fulfilling the law of love your neighbor as yourself if you're showing partiality. Showing partiality just is a fundamental, is like a bare bones, a basic ground level transgression that violates the commandment to love your neighbor as yourself. Hence why I think James is, his reasoning here is of the evaluation of commandments. There are weighty matters of the law, and then there's lesser matters of the law. And you could think that you're fine because you're holding to these lesser matters of the law, and yet you're violating a weighty matter of the law. So for whoever keeps the whole law but fails in one point has become guilty of all of it. So it's just to say that if you're thinking that you're loving your neighbor as yourself, but you are transgressing this basic fundamental thing in that law, then it's as if you have broken all, as if you've transgressed all. And he gives an example. For he who said, "Do not commit adultery," also said, "Do not murder." Now, arguably, I mean, it's in an intuitive way we understand that murder is, excuse me, is a bit weightier of a matter in the law than adultery. I mean, they're both sin, but to put it in Yeshua's way, if you're envying another man's wife, or if you're not envying another man's wife, you do good. I mean, of course, that it's good not to envy another man's wife, but you hate your brother in your heart. Yeshua says that if you hate your brother in your heart, it's as if you committed murder. And in Talmudic reasoning, to commit murder is tantamount to destroying an entire world. That's the weightiness of it. You're just you're destroying an image of God. That's what you're doing with murder. So you can't be okay with not envying or lusting after another man's wife and think that that makes it okay if you're over here hating your brother and committing murder. If you're over here hating your brother and committing murder in your heart, it's as if you're also committing adultery. You might as well be committing adultery. So that's the evaluation there. That's why it says if you stumble at one point, you're guilty of all of it. And that's the example that it gives. So speak and act as those who are to be judged under the law of liberty. Let's see. So in other words, live and speak and act as one who will be judged by the law. Um, these are people who think that they won't be judged by the law because they're doing A, B, and C. Well, you're neglecting D, so doing A, B, and C matters not. Is basically the reasoning there. All right. Okay, yeah, Trey clarifies with James 2. The point to make from James 2 in the context of this live stream is that the typical reading of this passage is literally false doctrine. In other words, don't try to obey, but James gives good doctrine. Correct, yeah. Yeah, and just a shout out to if you get a chance um to go if you go into Substack and go to the theology or to at theology experience or the theology experience on Substack, and you can check out Trey's article on James 2:10. It's a really good um it's a really good exposition of that passage. All right. I don't think I see any takers to come on. There are a number of people watching. Hmm. Just checking my notes to see if there's anything else I need to share. So, before I wrap up here, I just want to make a concluding statement. So, sound doctrine in the Bible is teaching that comes from the law and the prophets, is fulfilled by Yeshua, is continued by the apostles, and leads to holiness and obedience. In Scripture, doctrine is not merely what we confess, it is how we live. That's critical. Sound doctrine is how you live, not what you confess. And with that, I think I'm going to call it and wrap this up. Thank you again for those who tuned in to listen. I hope that was edifying to you and informative, and gives you some things to definitely chew on uh, and think more deeply on. May we have the grace of our Lord uh, through the Spirit to walk in truth, to walk in the light as He is in the light. So with that, I bless you all. Pray you have a wonderful night and a wonderful rest of the week. And until next time, God bless you.